"Maintenance is going to need a wet floor sign on that," he said. Not to her, past her, to the gate agent standing at the desk 15 feet away. As if the woman on the floor was furniture. As if she was part of the corridor, a feature of it, like the baseboard or the overhead lighting. The gate agent, a young man named Devon, looked up from his computer. He saw the woman. He saw the pilot. He opened his mouth, closed it, and said nothing. The pilot kept walking. Black uniform, 4 stripes on each shoulder, captain's bars, rolling his flight bag behind him with the particular confidence of a man who has never, not once, been on his knees in a public corridor and cannot imagine the circumstances that would put him there. His name was Craig Mercer. He'd been flying for 22 years. He was 49, tall, square-jawed, silver at the temples in the way that makes men look distinguished and women look old. He was the senior captain on Helios Air's Sutton Ridge base, the busiest base in the airline's regional network. He was about to have the worst week of his career. But he didn't know that yet. All he knew in that moment was that some cleaning woman was on the floor in the executive corridor, and she didn't have a wet floor sign, and somebody should tell maintenance. He didn't know who she was. Nobody in that corridor did, except for one person, who was watching from the end of the hallway with a cup of coffee in her hand and a very specific expression on her face. But we'll get to her. First, let me tell you about the woman on the floor. Her name was Vivien Price. And the reason she was on her knees in the corridor of Sutton Ridge Regional Airport at 6:42 on a Wednesday morning wasn't because she was paid to be there. It wasn't because she'd been assigned to clean that floor. It wasn't because someone had told her to do it. It was because she'd spilled her tea. That's it. She was carrying a paper cup of Earl Grey from the cafe near the security checkpoint. The lid wasn't sealed properly. The cup tipped. Tea splashed across the tile in a dark, spreading arc. And Vivien Price, 71 years old, arthritic knees, a woman who had built something most people in that airport couldn't imagine, got down on the floor and cleaned it up. She didn't call for a janitor. She didn't flag down an employee. She didn't stand over the spill and wait for someone else to handle it. She handled it. Because that's who Vivien Price was. That's who she'd always been. The kind of woman who sees a problem and puts her hands on it. The kind of woman who doesn't walk past a mess, not because it's her job, but because leaving it would mean someone else might slip. Someone else might fall. Someone else might get hurt because she decided her dignity was more important than a wet floor. She had a rag in her handbag. She always carried one. An old habit from decades ago when she cleaned hotel rooms for a living and learned that preparation wasn't about expecting the worst. It was about being ready for everything. So there she was, on her knees, wiping up Earl Grey with a cotton rag. She wore dark slacks, a cream-colored blouse, a gray cardigan, flat shoes with good soles, the kind made for walking long distances, which she did every day, because her doctor told her to keep moving. And Vivien Price listened to her doctor the way she listened to anyone who knew what they were talking about, carefully, completely, and without argument. She wore no jewelry except a thin gold chain with a small pendant, a wing. One wing, not two, the logo of Helios Air. Now, I need you to understand something about that pendant, because it matters. It wasn't merchandise. You couldn't buy it in an airport gift shop. You couldn't order it online. That pendant was one of 4 that existed in the world. They'd been made by a jeweler in Charlotte, North Carolina in 1996, 28 years ago, when Helios Air was not an airline. When Helios Air was a name written in ballpoint pen on the back of a paper napkin at a Waffle House on Route 29, next to a sketch of a wing and a column of numbers that didn't add up yet but would. The 4 pendants were made for the 4 people who sat at that Waffle House booth. Vivien Price was one of them. But her knees were on the tile and her rag was in her hand, and the pilot didn't see a pendant. He didn't see a founder. He saw a black woman past 70 on the floor, cleaning, and he filed her in the place his mind had already prepared, the place where women who looked like Vivien went automatically, without thought, without examination, without the smallest pause to wonder whether he might be wrong. He walked past. He made his comment about the wet floor sign, and he disappeared around the corner toward the crew lounge. Vivien finished wiping the floor. She folded the rag, put it in a plastic bag from her purse, and stood up slowly. Her right knee complained. It always complained now. She braced one hand against the wall and straightened, and for a moment she stood still, letting the ache settle. Then she looked in the direction the pilot had gone. She didn't look angry, she looked observant. The way a doctor looks at an X-ray. The way an engineer looks at a crack in a bridge support, not with emotion, with assessment. She noted his face. She noted his uniform. She noted the 4 stripes. She noted the name on his bag tag, which she'd read as he walked past, because Vivien Price had been reading details that other people missed for 50 years, and she wasn't about to stop now. Mercer C. She filed it. And then she continued down the corridor toward the door she'd been walking to in the first place. A door at the end of the hall marked conference room, authorized personnel only. She opened it and went inside. Let me tell you how Helios Air began, because you can't understand what happened next without understanding what came before. In 1994, Vivien Price was 41 years old and working 2 jobs. During the day, she was a housekeeper at the Marriott Courtyard off I-85 near Charlotte. At night, she took classes at Central Piedmont Community College, business management, accounting, organizational leadership. She'd been taking classes for 3 years, 2 courses at a time, paying with a combination of financial aid, tips she saved in a coffee can on her dresser, and a small scholarship from her church. She had a daughter, Teresa, who was 16. She had a mother, Opal, who was 67 and had emphysema and needed an oxygen tank to climb the stairs. She had a 2-bedroom apartment in a complex off West Boulevard where the hot water worked on alternate days, and the landlord responded to repair requests on a schedule that could only be described as geological. She did not have a husband. She did not have savings. She did not have connections or capital or a family name that opened doors. What she had was a notebook. A spiral notebook, college-ruled, with a green cover. She kept it in her apron pocket at the Marriott, and during her breaks, 15 minutes in the morning, 15 in the afternoon, she sat in the supply closet on an overturned bucket and wrote in it. She wrote numbers, revenue projections, route maps, fuel cost estimates, passenger load calculations. She wrote business plans, not the polished, bound kind with executive summaries and market analysis charts, the raw kind. The kind that starts with a question: what would it cost to fly one plane from Charlotte to Raleigh 3 times a day? She'd gotten the idea 2 years earlier in 1992 when she tried to fly from Charlotte to Asheville for her cousin's funeral. The ticket cost more than her rent. A 90-minute flight, and it cost more than the roof over her head. She'd taken the bus instead, 4.5 hours each way. She'd arrived late. She missed the service. She sat in the church parking lot in her black dress and listened to the hymns through the walls. On the bus ride home, she'd looked out the window at the mountains and asked herself a question that would change her life. Why does it cost so much to fly a short distance? She didn't know the answer, but she knew how to find out. She went to the library. She read everything she could find about regional aviation, the economics, the regulations, the history. She learned about commuter airlines and essential air service subsidies and the deregulation of 1978 and the gap in the market for affordable short-haul flights in the Southeast. She learned about Part 135 certificates and Part 121 operations and the difference between them. She learned about aircraft leasing and maintenance reserves and fuel hedging. She learned it on her breaks, in the supply closet, on an overturned bucket. By 1994, she had a plan. Not a perfect plan. A plan with holes and guesses and assumptions that needed testing. But a plan with a core idea that was sound. Short-haul flights between mid-sized southern cities, at prices working people could afford, using small turboprop aircraft that were cheap to operate and could land at regional airports with short runways. She needed three things to make it work. She needed a pilot, she needed money, and she needed someone who knew how to navigate the FAA. She found the pilot at a barbecue. His name was Jimmy Calloway. He was 43, a former Air Force transport pilot who'd been flying charter flights out of a small airport in Concord, North Carolina. He was black, calm, precise, and bored out of his mind flying weekend charters for duck hunters. Vivien told him her idea. He listened. He asked questions, hard, specific, technical questions about range and payload and runway requirements. She answered every one from memory. No notes. She'd memorized the numbers the way she memorized hymns, by repetition, by necessity, by love. Jimmy said, "You're serious." Vivien said, "I've been serious for 2 years. I just needed a pilot." He said, "You need more than a pilot." She said, "I know, that's why I'm still talking." She found the money through a woman named Harriet Voss, a retired school principal from Durham who had inherited land, sold it, and was looking for an investment that wasn't the stock market. Harriet was 61, sharp, skeptical, and willing to listen. Vivien showed her the notebook. Harriet read every page, took it home, read it again, came back with 37 questions. Vivien answered 35 of them on the spot. The other 2 she answered within a week after going back to the library. Harriet invested $380,000. It was most of what she had. The fourth person was a man named Delray Watts, Jamaican-born, 50, a former FAA inspector who'd left the agency to consult for small airlines. Delray knew the regulatory landscape like a surgeon knows anatomy. He knew which applications to file, which inspectors to call, which boxes to check, and in what order. Without Delray, the FAA certification process would have taken years. With him, it took 14 months. 4 people, a Waffle House booth, a napkin with a wing drawn on it. Helios Air received its Part 135 certificate in March 1996. Its first flight departed Charlotte Douglas International Airport on April 11, 1996, a 9-seat Beechcraft 1900 bound for Raleigh-Durham, with Jimmy Calloway in the left seat and 6 paying passengers in the cabin. The fare was $39 way. Vivien wasn't on that flight. She was at the gate, watching the plane push back. She was wearing her Marriott uniform because she'd come straight from work. She still had her apron in her bag. She watched the plane taxi. She watched it turn onto the runway. She watched it lift off, that particular moment when the wheels leave the ground and the machine becomes something else, something that defies the fundamental condition of being earthbound. She cried. Not a lot, just enough. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and went home and made dinner for Teresa and checked on Opal's oxygen levels, and sat at the kitchen table after everyone was asleep and opened her green notebook and wrote the date at the top of a fresh page. April 11, 1996, first flight, 6 passengers on time. Then she wrote, "Tomorrow we do it again." And they did, again and again and again, for 28 years. Helios Air grew. Not fast. Vivien didn't believe in fast. She believed in steady. She believed in solvent. She believed in making the next right decision and then the one after that, and never borrowing so much that you couldn't survive being wrong. By 2000, they had 4 aircraft and served 6 cities. By 2005, they had 12 aircraft and served 14. By 2010, they'd upgraded to regional jets, the CRJ-200s, then Embraer 145s, and served 22 cities across 7 states. By 2015, they were operating under a Part 121 certificate with full jet service, connecting small and mid-sized cities across the Southeast with flights that cost less than a tank of gas. They were never the biggest. They were never the flashiest. They didn't have TV commercials or celebrity endorsements or first-class cabins with lie-flat seats. What they had was reliability, affordability, and a reputation, especially in black communities across the South, as the airline that gave a damn. The airline that flew routes the big carriers abandoned. The airline that kept fares low enough for a grandmother to visit her grandchildren without choosing between a plane ticket and her electric bill. Vivien stepped down as CEO in 2018. She was 65. Her knees were bad. Her doctor told her to slow down. She didn't slow down, she shifted. She moved to chairman of the board. She came to the office 3 days a week instead of 6. She stopped flying to every station to inspect the gates personally, which she'd done for 22 years, twice a year, every station, no exceptions. But she still visited, unannounced, without an entourage, without her name on a lanyard. She'd walk through an airport the way she'd always walked through everything, observing, listening, noticing the things that people stop noticing when they think nobody important is watching. The current CEO was a man named Franklin Odell, 54, Harvard MBA, recruited from a major carrier to scale Helios to the next level. He was competent. Vivien had chosen him herself. He was also the kind of executive who operated from conference rooms and earnings calls, and who had never, not once in his career, gotten on his knees to clean a floor. He respected Vivien. Everyone at the executive level respected Vivien, but there's a difference between respecting the founder and understanding the founder. Franklin respected her legacy. He did not always understand her methods. Like the visits, he told her gently that unannounced station visits by the board chairman could be disruptive, that employees might feel surveilled, that it might be better to schedule them with notice, with a proper delegation. Vivien had listened politely. Then she'd kept visiting. Because Vivien knew something that Franklin's MBA hadn't taught him. The truth about a company lives on the floor, not in the conference room. It lives in how the gate agent talks to a passenger who missed a connection. It lives in how the ramp crew handles luggage when nobody's watching. It lives in the corridor at 6:42 in the morning when a 71-year-old woman spills her tea and a captain walks past her like she's invisible. That's where the truth lives. And Vivien was always looking for it. Now back to the corridor. Vivien went into conference room as she closed the door behind her and sat down at the table. She was early. The meeting didn't start for 20 minutes. She opened her handbag and took out a folder thin, maybe 15 pages. She put on her reading glasses and began reviewing the contents. Financial summaries, operational metrics, passenger complaint data. She read the way she always read, with a pen in her hand, making small marks in the margins. A check here. A question mark there. A circled number that didn't look right. She was reviewing the quarterly performance data for Helios Air's Sutton Ridge base. This meeting was not on the base manager's calendar. It was not on Franklin Odell's calendar. It was on Vivien's calendar only, a private note in the leather planner she kept in her handbag, written in her own handwriting. Wed 7 a.m. Sutton Ridge, sit in on ops brief. Unannounced. She did this regularly, not to catch people, to see. While she waited, she thought about the pilot in the corridor. She wasn't thinking about the insult. Not exactly. The insult was small. She'd survived insults that would make that one look like a greeting card. She'd been called worse than invisible. She'd been called names. She'd been told to her face by a bank loan officer in 1995 that women like you didn't start airlines. She'd been told by an FAA inspector during a certification review that he'd never seen a cleaning lady fill out a Part 135 application before. She'd smiled at that one, signed the application, got the certificate. No, what she was thinking about wasn't the insult. It was the assumption. The assumption was the thing. The assumption was always the thing. Captain Craig Mercer had looked at her for less than a second, a fraction of a glance, and his brain had completed a circuit that took no conscious effort at all. Black, old, on the floor, cleaning, therefore maintenance staff, therefore beneath notice, therefore talk past her, not to her. That circuit was fast. That circuit was practiced. That circuit didn't require malice or hatred or even awareness. It ran on something older and deeper than any of those things. It ran on the accumulated weight of every image, every assumption, every shortcut that a society builds into its people over decades. The invisible architecture of who matters and who doesn't, who gets seen and who gets sorted. Vivien wasn't angry about the circuit. She was concerned about it. Because a pilot who runs that circuit in a corridor will run it in a cockpit. A pilot who dismisses a person based on appearance will dismiss information based on source. A pilot who doesn't pause to question his first assumption about a woman on the floor will not pause to question his first assumption about a warning light, or a weather report, or a junior first officer who's trying to tell him something he doesn't want to hear. Vivien had been in aviation for 28 years. She knew the accident reports. She knew that the most dangerous thing in a cockpit wasn't mechanical failure. It was authority gradient, the gap between the captain and everyone else. The gap that makes a first officer hesitate to speak up. The gap that makes a captain dismiss a concern because it came from someone he considered below him. That gap killed people. And a man who walked past a woman on the floor without seeing her had a gap the size of a canyon. Vivien wrote a note in the margin of her folder. Mercer, C. Captain, corridor interaction, observe. She underlined observe. She did not underline confront or report or discipline. She underlined observe. Because Vivien Price didn't start with conclusions. She started with questions. At 7:00 a.m., the door opened and the room began to fill. The Sutton Ridge base operations team filed in. Base manager, assistant base manager, chief pilot, crew scheduling supervisor, maintenance director, customer service lead. 8 people, all carrying coffee and laptops and the slightly harried expressions of people who'd been awake since before the sun. The base manager was a man named Rick Talvinen, late 40s, trim, efficient, the kind of manager who ran a tight operation and knew it and wanted everyone else to know it too. He'd been at Sutton Ridge for 6 years. His numbers were good. His on-time performance was above the network average. He was on the short list for a regional VP promotion. He walked in, saw Vivien sitting at the table and stopped. He didn't recognize her. This is important. Rick Talvinen had been with Helios Air for 6 years, and he did not recognize the founder of his airline. How is that possible? Because Vivien's photo wasn't on the wall. It wasn't on the website, not prominently anyway. There was a small Our History page with a group photo from 1996, but Vivien was 41 in that photo, with long dark hair and no glasses, and she looked nothing like the 71-year-old woman sitting at the conference table in a cream blouse and gray cardigan. Franklin Odell had met Vivien many times, of course. The board members knew her. The executive team knew her. But the base-level managers, some had met her at company events, some hadn't. Rick Talvinen was in the second group. He'd been hired from a competitor. He'd never attended a board meeting. He knew the name Vivien Price the way most people know the name of someone famous, abstractly, historically, without a face attached. So when he saw an older black woman sitting in his conference room at 7 in the morning, he made the same circuit Craig Mercer had made in the corridor. Not identical. Rick's circuit was more polite, but it was the same model. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said. "This is a restricted meeting, staff only. Can I help you find where you need to be?" "Can I help you find where you need to be?" Said warmly, said helpfully, said with the absolute certainty that wherever this woman needed to be, it was not here. Vivien looked up from her folder. "Good morning," she said. "I'm fine right here, thank you." Rick hesitated. He looked at the other staff members filing in. He looked at Vivien. He lowered his voice slightly, the way people do when they're trying to be kind while also being firm. "Ma'am, I appreciate that, but this is an internal operations briefing. It's not open to the public. If you're a passenger and you need assistance, our customer service desk is. I'm not a passenger, Vivien said. Okay, are you, with a vendor, a contractor? No. Then I'm going to need to ask you too. My name is Vivien Price. She said it simply. The way you say your name when you've been saying it for 71 years, and it has never once needed decoration. Rick blinked. The room changed. Not all at once. It changed the way a room changes when someone opens a window you didn't know was there, a shift in pressure, a new source of light. Two of the people at the table recognized the name instantly. The maintenance director, a woman named Gwen, put her coffee down. The crew scheduling supervisor, a man named Darren, leaned forward. Rick Tolvanen's face went through 3 stages in 4 seconds. Confusion, recognition, a color that lives somewhere between pale and transparent. Ms. Price, he said, I'm sorry, I didn't recognize. That's all right, Vivien said. Please sit down. I'm not here to disrupt your meeting. I'd like to observe. Of course, absolutely. Rick pulled out a chair, not for himself, for her, as if she might want to move to a better seat, and then realized she was already seated and the gesture was pointless, and he stood there for a moment with his hand on the back of an empty chair, looking like a man who had just tried to direct the ocean to a different part of the beach. Sit down, Rick, Vivien said gently. Run your meeting. He sat down. He opened his laptop. He began the operations brief. And for the next 45 minutes, Vivien Price watched. She watched and she listened, and she wrote in the margins of her folder, and here is what she observed. The meeting was competent. Rick ran it efficiently. The numbers were reviewed, the action items were assigned, the timelines were discussed. On the surface, everything worked. But underneath the surface, Vivien saw currents. She saw that when Gwen, the maintenance director, raised a concern about a recurring hydraulic issue on one of the Embraer 145s, tail number N471HL, Rick acknowledged it with a nod and moved on without assigning a follow-up. Gwen started to press the point. Rick said, "We'll circle back on that." Gwen closed her mouth. Vivien noted that Gwen was the only woman on the operations team. She noted that "we'll circle back" was a phrase that meant we won't circle back. She noted that a recurring hydraulic issue on an aircraft was not the kind of thing you circled back on. She saw that when Darren, the crew scheduling supervisor, mentioned that 3 pilots had raised concerns about the new rest period scheduling, that the minimum legal rest was being met on paper, but that the actual rest was inadequate due to hotel noise complaints and ground transportation delays. Rick said, "Legal rest is legal rest. If they want more, they can bid for different trips." Vivien noted that legal rest is legal rest, the minimum standard treated as the maximum effort. She saw that when a customer service complaint was reviewed, a passenger in a wheelchair who'd been left on the jet bridge for 22 minutes because the ground crew hadn't been notified of the accommodation request. Rick called it an isolated incident and suggested retraining the gate agent. Vivien looked at the complaint data in her folder. She found 3 similar complaints in the past quarter. It wasn't isolated. It was patterned. But Rick either hadn't read the data or hadn't connected the dots. And then, the part that made Vivien set down her pen. The crew scheduling update included a brief mention of a first officer named Quesa Wells. Quesa had filed an internal report 3 weeks earlier about a captain, unnamed in the briefing, who had, during a flight from Sutton Ridge to Nashville, overridden her callout of a wind shear alert on approach. Quesa had called out the alert per standard procedure. The captain had said, "I've got it." Quesa had repeated the callout. The captain had said, "I said I've got it. Fly the airplane." They'd landed without incident. But Quesa had filed the report because the captain's response had violated crew resource management protocols. The protocols specifically designed to prevent authority gradient accidents. Darren mentioned the report as a line item. Rick's response was there an incident? No, they landed fine. Then it's a CRM note, not an action item. Log it and move on. Vivien did not move on. Who was the captain? She asked. The room turned. It was the first time she'd spoken since the meeting began. Rick looked at her. I'm sorry. The captain on that flight, the one who overrode the first officer's windshield callout, who was it? Rick looked at Darren. Darren looked at his laptop. I'd have to pull the report, Darren said. I don't have the name in front of me. Pull it, Vivien said. Darren typed, scrolled, found the file. Captain Craig Mercer, he said. Vivien didn't react. She didn't nod. She didn't write it down. She didn't need to. She'd already written his name in her margin an hour ago in the corridor when he'd walked past her hand. What was the disposition of the report? She asked. It was logged, Rick said, filed per protocol. Was there a follow-up conversation with Captain Mercer? I don't believe so. There was no incident, so. A first officer reported a CRM violation. A captain overrode a windshield callout on approach, and there was no follow-up conversation. It wasn't a question. It was a statement shaped like a question. The kind of sentence that gives you one chance to correct the answer before the answer corrects you. Rick shifted in his chair. Ms. Price, with respect, we get CRM notes from time to time. If we followed up on every single one, we'd. Yes. The single word was so quiet that Rick leaned forward to hear it. And in leaning forward, he found himself looking directly into the eyes of a woman who had been in aviation since before he'd finished college, who had built the airline whose logo was on his badge, and who was asking him a simple question with the patience of someone who was going to wait for the right answer no matter how long it took. We'd be doing our job, Vivien said. That's what we'd be doing. Silence. Pull every CRM report filed at this base in the past 12 months, she said. Every one. I want to know which ones had follow-up and which ones didn't. I want to know which captains are named. I want to know if there's a pattern. Rick opened his mouth. And I want it by Friday, Vivien said. She said it the way she said everything, without raising her voice, without sharpening her tone, without any of the theatrics that people associate with authority. She said it the way a woman says something when she's been saying things like it for 28 years, and every single time, the thing she said turned out to be the thing that needed saying. Rick closed his mouth. Yes, ma'am, he said. The meeting ended. The room emptied. Vivien stayed. She sat at the conference table and reviewed her notes. She added observations. She drew a small diagram, a web, really, connecting the things she'd seen that morning. A pilot who didn't see a woman on the floor. A first officer whose windshield callout was overridden. A base manager who logged the report and didn't follow up. A hydraulic issue that got tabled. A wheelchair passenger left on a jet bridge. Rest period concerns dismissed with a legal technicality. These were not separate problems. They were the same problem wearing different clothes. They were all symptoms of a culture that had learned to meet the minimum standard and mistake it for excellence. A culture where concerns from the wrong people, a female maintenance director, a junior first officer, a passenger in a wheelchair, a woman on the floor, were heard but not listened to, acknowledged but not acted on, logged but not learned from. Vivien had seen this before. She'd seen it at other stations. She'd seen it in other companies during the years when Helios was growing and she studied competitors to learn what not to do. She'd seen it in the accident reports she'd read, every one published by the NTSB for the past 20 years, because Vivien Price believed that if you ran an airline, you owed it to every passenger to understand how airlines failed. And they always failed the same way. Not with a bang, with a drift, a slow, silent drift away from the standard, so gradual that nobody noticed until the standard was a memory and the drift was the new normal. A first officer stops calling out alerts because the captain dismisses them. A maintenance concern gets tabled because the numbers are good enough. A customer complaint gets called isolated because looking at the pattern would require doing something about it. Drift. Vivien had built Helios Air to resist drift. She'd built it with checklists and protocols, and a culture that was supposed to value every voice in the room, regardless of rank. She'd built it sitting on an overturned bucket in a supply closet with a green notebook, and a conviction that an airline could be safe and affordable and humane all at the same time. But she'd stepped back. She'd moved to chairman. She'd let Franklin run the operation. And Franklin was competent, genuinely competent, but Franklin managed from the conference room. Franklin read reports. Franklin didn't walk corridors at 6:42 in the morning and get his tea spilled and end up on his knees and see what the floor looked like from down there. Vivien saw what the floor looked like. And she was concerned. The woman who'd been watching from the end of the corridor, the one with the coffee, the one I mentioned earlier, was named Sandra Akafer. Sandra was the station's customer service lead. She was 38, Nigerian-American, with close-cropped hair and a quiet intensity that made people either deeply comfortable or slightly nervous, depending on which side of her attention they were on. She'd been at Helios for 7 years. She knew who Vivien Price was, not from a photo on the wall from a company-wide town hall in 2017 where Vivien had spoken for 40 minutes without notes about the history of the airline and the values it was built on. Sandra had remembered every word. She'd gone home that night and told her husband, "That woman built this airline from a notebook in a supply closet, and she still talks like a person, not an executive, a person." So when Sandra had walked around the corner at 6:41 that morning and seen Vivien Price on her knees wiping up tea, she'd recognized her instantly. And when she'd seen Captain Mercer walk past without stopping, without looking, without acknowledging the woman on the floor as a human being, let alone as the founder of the company whose uniform he wore, Sandra had stood still, watching, holding her coffee, feeling something tighten in her chest. She hadn't intervened, not because she was afraid, because she wanted to see what Vivien would do. And what Vivien had done was get up, brush off her knees, and walk into conference room like a woman who had just added one more data point to a set she'd been collecting for decades. After the meeting, Sandra found Vivien in the corridor. "Ms. Price." Vivien looked up. "Yes. I'm Sandra Akafer, customer service lead here at Sutton Ridge. I know who you are. You spoke at the 2022 Service Quality Summit. You presented the data on boarding assistance response times." Sandra blinked. That summit had been 2 years ago, 200 people in the room. Sandra had spoken for 12 minutes, and Vivien remembered. Yes, that was me. Your data was excellent. I referenced it in a board presentation last year. The 30-second benchmark you proposed for wheelchair assistance response, we adopted it network-wide." Sandra stared. She hadn't known that. Nobody had told her. "I wanted to," Sandra hesitated. "I saw what happened in the corridor this morning with Captain Mercer." Vivien's expression didn't change. "What did you see?" "I saw you cleaning up a spill. I saw him walk past you. I saw him talk about you to Devon at the gate desk as if you weren't there." "And what did you think?" Sandra paused. The question wasn't what she expected. Vivien wasn't asking how did it make you feel or what do you think should happen. She was asking what Sandra thought, what she observed, what she assessed. "I thought," Sandra said carefully, "that a person who doesn't see the people around him isn't going to see the problems around him either." Vivien looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded, a single, small nod of recognition. "How long have you been at this station, Sandra?" 7 years. "And in those 7 years, how many times have you raised a concern that was dismissed?" Sandra exhaled. It was the kind of exhale that carries the weight of 7 years. "More than I've counted." "Tell me about one." Sandra told her about the wheelchair incident. Not the one in the complaint data, a different one. 6 months earlier, a passenger named Mrs. Landry, 83 years old, flying alone from Sutton Ridge to Atlanta to see her son. Sandra had personally ensured that the wheelchair assistance was arranged. She'd confirmed it with the gate agent. She'd confirmed it with the ground crew. She'd done everything right. But the ground crew forgot, or didn't prioritize it, or got busy with baggage. And Mrs. Landry sat on the jet bridge for 19 minutes in July heat in a wheelchair alone while the aircraft was being serviced. Sandra had filed a report. She'd recommended a process change, a real-time confirmation system between the gate agent and the ground crew for accommodation requests. It was simple. It was cheap. It would have taken 2 weeks to implement. Rick had reviewed the report. He'd called it a good suggestion and said he'd look into it. That was 6 months ago. Nothing had changed, and 3 more wheelchair passengers had been left waiting since then. "I'm not in a position to push," Sandra said. "I've tried, but I'm customer service, not operations, not management. The people who can make the change don't see it as urgent because it doesn't affect the numbers they're measured on." Vivien listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't nod along performatively. She listened the way she'd always listened, with her whole attention, as if the person speaking was the most important source of information in the room. When Sandra finished, Vivien said, "Write it up. Everything you just told me. The original incident, your recommendation, the follow-up or lack of it, the subsequent incidents. Include the data, include the dates." "Write it up for who?" "For me, send it to my office. I'll give you the address." "Ms. Price, with respect, I've written things up before. They go into a file." "Not my file," Vivien said. "My file doesn't sit." Sandra looked at her, and something in Vivien's face, not a promise, not a performance, just a quiet certainty that was older than the airline and more durable than any org chart, made Sandra believe her. "I'll have it to you by Thursday," Sandra said. "Thank you, Sandra." Vivien put on her cardigan, picked up her handbag, and walked toward the exit. Sandra watched her go, 5'4", 71 years old, gray cardigan, no entourage, no title on a lanyard, looking for all the world like somebody's grandmother heading to a doctor's appointment. Looking like nobody. Looking like the most important person in the building. Vivien drove home. It was a 30-minute drive from Sutton Ridge to her house, a modest 3-bedroom ranch on a quiet street in a town called Edenton. She'd bought the house in 2001, with the first real money Helios ever paid her. Before that, she'd taken no salary. For 5 years, she'd worked for free running the airline during the day, cleaning hotel rooms at night, until the airline was profitable enough to pay her a salary and she could finally quit the Marriott. She still kept the rag in her purse. Some things you don't let go of, not because you're sentimental, because you remember. She got home at 8:15. She made a cup of tea, Earl Grey, because the last one had ended up on the floor, and sat at her kitchen table with her folder and her phone. She called Franklin Odell. "Good morning, Franklin." "Vivien, good morning. Everything all right?" "I visited Sutton Ridge this morning." A pause. She could hear Franklin recalibrating. He didn't love the unannounced visits. He considered them a management-style relic from a smaller era, but he also knew better than to say so. "How did it go?" "The meeting was competent. Rick runs an efficient operation on the surface, but I have concerns." "What kind of concerns?" Vivien described what she'd seen, the hydraulic issue tabled without follow-up, the rest period complaints dismissed, the CRM report filed without action. She didn't describe the corridor incident. Not yet. That was hers. She'd use it when it was useful. "I've asked Rick to pull all CRM reports from the past 12 months. I want you to do the same thing, network-wide." "Network-wide, Vivien, that's important, that's what it is." Another pause. "All right, I'll have the team compile it." "Thank you." And Franklin, the wheelchair assistance issue. "We adopted Sandra Acker's 30-second benchmark 2 years ago. I want compliance data on that benchmark across all stations, every station. How often are we meeting it and how often aren't we? I'll look into it. Don't look into it, measure it. There's a difference. She said it gently, almost affectionately, but the steel underneath was unmistakable. Yes, ma'am, Franklin said, and he meant it. Because whatever Franklin thought about Vivien's management style, he understood one thing with perfect clarity. Vivien Price had been right more often than anyone he'd ever worked with. Her instincts weren't instincts. They were pattern recognition honed over 3 decades. When Vivien said she was concerned, you got concerned. When Vivien said measure it, you measured it. One more thing, Vivien said. Captain Craig Mercer, Sutton Ridge Base. I'd like his personnel file, his training records, and his CRM evaluation history. Can I ask why? A first officer filed a report about him 3 weeks ago. Wind shear callout overridden on approach. The base didn't follow up. That's not good. No, it's not. I'll have the file sent to you today. Thank you, Franklin. She hung up. She drank her tea. She looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, where a cardinal was sitting on the fence post, and she thought about Quesa Wells. Quesa Wells was 29 years old. She'd been flying for Helios Air for 3 years. She was one of 14 black female pilots in the airline's roster of 211. She'd grown up in Memphis. Her mother was a nurse. Her father drove a city bus. She'd wanted to fly since she was 7 years old and saw a documentary about Bessie Coleman on PBS. She'd gone to Embry-Riddle on a scholarship. She'd graduated with honors. She'd instructed for 2 years to build hours, then applied to every regional airline in the Southeast. Helios hired her. She'd been grateful. She was still grateful. But she was also tired. Tired of being the only woman in the cockpit on every flight. Tired of the subtle calibration she made every time she flew with a new captain. Figuring out within the first 10 minutes whether this was a captain who would listen to her, a captain who would tolerate her, or a captain who would overrule her because something about her voice or her face or her presence in the left seat triggered an assumption he'd never examine. Most captains were fine, professional, collegial. Some were great mentors who went out of their way to include her, to teach, to treat the cockpit as a partnership. And then there was Mercer. She'd flown with Craig Mercer 4 times. Each time the dynamic was the same. He was polite. He was civil. He never raised his voice. He never said anything that in isolation would constitute harassment or discrimination. He was too careful for that or too unaware. But he overrode her. Not on everything. On the routine stuff, he let her do her job. But the moment anything required judgment, a weather deviation, an approach change, a callout, he took over. Not with hostility, with certainty. The certainty of a man who believed at some level he'd never articulated that his judgment was inherently superior and that any input from the person in the right seat was background noise. The wind shear callout was the one she couldn't let go. They were on approach into Nashville. The ATIS was reporting gusty conditions. Quesa saw the wind shear indicator flash on the display and called it out, "Wind shear ahead," exactly as she was trained to do. The standard response is for the pilot flying to acknowledge the callout and either execute a go-around or adjust the approach profile. It's a 2-person protocol. It depends on both people in the cockpit doing their jobs. Mercer said, "I've got it." She repeated the callout, "Wind shear ahead." I said, "I've got it, fly the airplane." They landed. Nothing happened. The airplane was fine. The passengers deplaned and went about their lives, unaware that anything unusual had occurred. But Quesa knew. She knew that a captain who says, "I've got it" to a wind shear callout is a captain who is telling his first officer, "Your voice doesn't matter. Your training doesn't matter. Your observation doesn't matter. I am the authority, and the authority doesn't need your input." She filed the report. She filed it knowing that it might not go anywhere. She filed it knowing that Craig Mercer had 22 years of seniority and she had 3. She filed it knowing that the word of a junior black female first officer against a senior white male captain was not, in the calculus of most organizations, an even trade. She filed it anyway, because Keisha Wells had learned something from her mother, the nurse, who had spent 30 years advocating for patients in a hospital system that didn't always listen. Her mother used to say, "You document everything. You write it down. You put it in the file, because the file remembers when people forget." Keisha put it in the file. And then she waited. 3 weeks. No follow-up, no conversation, no acknowledgement that her report had been read, reviewed, or taken seriously. Until Vivien Price asked a question in a conference room. Craig Mercer's personnel file arrived at Vivien's house by secure courier on Thursday morning. She read it at her kitchen table, all of it: training records, annual evaluations, line check reports, CRM assessments. On the surface, the file was clean, good evaluations, no accidents, no incidents, no formal complaints, 22 years of service with a record that any pilot would be proud of. But Vivien didn't read surfaces, she read patterns. She found 3 CRM notes in the past 5 years, all from different first officers, all describing the same dynamic. Captain assumes control during non-emergency situations without communication. Captain dismisses callouts. Captain does not debrief after flights. 3 notes, 3 different first officers, same captain, same behavior. None of the 3 had resulted in follow-up action. They'd been logged, filed, forgotten. Vivien set down the file and called a number she hadn't called in a long time. Jimmy Calloway, 72 years old, retired, living in a cabin near Asheville, the city that Vivien had tried to fly to in 1992, the trip that started everything. He spent his days fishing, reading, and occasionally consulting for small charter operations that reminded him of the early days. Jimmy had been Helios Air's first pilot. He'd also been its first chief pilot, its first director of operations, and, for the first 3 years, its only pilot. He'd flown every route, trained every hire, and built the safety culture that Vivien had designed on paper and Jimmy had implemented in the air. "Viv," he said when he picked up. He was the only person alive who called her that. "You only call when something's wrong." "That's not true. I called you on your birthday." "That was 7 months ago." "I'm calling now." "What's wrong?" She told him the corridor, the CRM reports, the pattern, the first officer whose callout was dismissed. Jimmy listened. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. "What's the captain's name?" "Craig Mercer." "Don't know him, hired after my time, but I know the type. 20-year captains who have never had a serious incident and think that means they're good. They're not good, they're lucky, and luck runs out. That's what I'm afraid of." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to make sure it's addressed, properly, not logged and filed, addressed. And if the base pushes back, then the base will learn something about who built it." Jimmy laughed, a low, warm laugh. "Viv, you've been teaching people that lesson for 30 years and they still don't learn." "Then I'll teach it again." On Friday, Rick Talvinen sent the CRM report data, all 12 months, all captains, all notes. Vivien read every page. Then she convened a meeting, not at Sutton Ridge, at the Helios Air corporate office in Charlotte. She invited Franklin Odell. She invited the vice president of flight operations. She invited the director of safety. She invited the head of human resources. She did not invite Rick Talvinen, not yet. She presented the data, not just from Sutton Ridge, from the entire network. She'd asked Franklin to compile it, and he had, and the picture it painted was troubling. Across the network, CRM reports filed by first officers against captains had a follow-up rate of 31%, less than a third. That meant more than 2 out of every 3 reports, reports about cockpit communication failures, Authority gradient violations, dismissed callouts, were logged and never acted on. The follow-up rate for reports filed by female first officers was 22%. The follow-up rate for reports filed by first officers of color was 19%. Vivien let those numbers sit on the screen. "We built this airline on the principle that every voice matters," she said. "That was in the original charter. I wrote it. I meant it. And these numbers tell me we're not living it." The room was quiet. "This is not a blame exercise," she continued. "I'm not here to punish individuals. I'm here because we have a systemic gap between what we say and what we do, and systemic gaps in aviation don't stay theoretical. They become operational, and operational gaps become accidents." She outlined 3 directives, not recommendations, directives. Vivien Price was chairman of the board. She had the authority to issue them, and she did. First, mandatory follow-up on every CRM report within 72 hours. No exceptions. Every report triggers a conversation with the reporting officer and with the captain named. Documented, tracked, reviewed. Second, an independent review of the Sutton Ridge base's safety culture, conducted by the Director of Safety's team, including confidential interviews with all flight crew based at that station. Focus on authority gradient, cockpit communication, and response to crew concerns. Third, Captain Craig Mercer would be temporarily removed from the line pending a CRM evaluation and retraining. Not as punishment, as protocol. A captain with 3 unaddressed CRM notes and a documented callout override was a captain who needed to be evaluated before he flew again. Franklin looked at the directives. He looked at Vivien. "Vivien, pulling a captain off the line is going to raise questions." "It should raise questions. That's the point. The question it should raise is, why wasn't this done 3 notes ago? Mercer has 22 years. He's union. There'll be pushback." "There should be. Pushback is a system working. Silence is a system failing. I'd rather have pushback." Franklin nodded. Not eagerly. Carefully. The nod of a man who was beginning to understand that the woman across the table from him was not managing a crisis. She was correcting a drift, and the drift was older than any single incident and wider than any single station. "I'll implement all 3, he said. "Thank you, Franklin." Captain Craig Mercer was notified of his temporary removal from the line on Monday morning. He was furious. Not loudly furious. Mercer wasn't a shouter. He was the kind of furious that manifests as clipped sentences and controlled breathing, and a jaw clenched so tight you could see the muscles working under the skin. He went to Rick Talvinen's office. "What is this?" Rick, who had spent the weekend processing the reality that the woman he'd tried to escort out of his conference room was the founder of his airline, was not in a strong position to help. "It came from corporate," Rick said. "The chairman's office." "The chairman? Since when does the chairman pull captains off the line for CRM notes? I've never had an incident, not one. 22 years. "I know, Craig, but there's a process now. New directive. Every CRM report gets a follow-up, and yours had a few. A few notes from first officers who couldn't handle a standard approach. That's what we're grounding captains for now." Rick said nothing. He was thinking about Vivien Price's face in the conference room when she'd asked, "Who was the captain?" He was thinking about the way she'd said, "We'd be doing our job." He was thinking about the fact that he'd tried to send her to the customer service desk. "Craig," he said, "just do the evaluation, do the retraining. It's a few weeks. You'll be back on the line." "This is political. Someone's making a statement." "It's not political, it's safety." "It's—" Mercer stopped. He looked at Rick. "Who is this chairman anyway?" "Vivien Price. I've never even met her." Rick looked at his desk. He picked up a pen. He put it down. He looked at Mercer. "Actually," he said, "you have." I want to stay with what Rick said next, because it's the part of the story where the ground shifts. Last Wednesday, Rick said. In the corridor, there was a woman on the floor cleaning up a spill. Mercer stared at him. That was Vivien Price. Mercer was quiet for 10 seconds. 15. 20. I want you to count that in your head. 20 seconds of a man standing in an office realizing that the woman he'd walked past, the woman he'd talked about as if she were a piece of the floor, was the person who had created the airline he'd flown for, the uniform he wore, the paycheck he cashed, the career he'd built his identity around. That's not, he said. She was on the floor. She spilled her tea. She was cleaning. Yes, she was. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The sentence he couldn't finish was the sentence that explained everything: why he'd walked past, why he hadn't looked, why he'd spoken about her instead of to her. The sentence was about what he saw when he looked at a black woman on her knees, and finishing it would mean saying out loud the thing that had been running silently in his operating system for 49 years. He didn't say it, but he heard it for the first time. He heard the circuit complete, and the sound it made was ugly. The CRM evaluation, he said. When does it start? Next week. He nodded. He picked up his flight bag. He walked out. He didn't say anything else. Sometimes silence isn't avoidance. Sometimes it's the first sound of a man hearing himself clearly. Whether he'd keep listening was a different question. The Independent Safety Culture Review at Sutton Ridge took 3 weeks. It was conducted by a team of 2 from the Director of Safety's office, 1 external aviation safety consultant, and 1 HR representative. They interviewed every flight crew member based at the station, confidentially, individually, in a room with no management present. The findings were significant. 12 first officers reported feeling uncomfortable raising safety concerns with specific captains. 8 of those 12 were women or people of color. The discomfort wasn't about explicit hostility, it was about dismissal, being cut off, being overridden, being told "I've got it" when procedure required a 2-person response. The review also found that the base's maintenance concern tracking was behind standard. Gwen's hydraulic issue, the one Rick had tabled, was real. Tail number N471HL had a recurring hydraulic anomaly that had been documented in maintenance logs, but deferred 4 times because it didn't meet the threshold for mandatory grounding. The review team recommended immediate inspection. The inspection found a degraded hydraulic seal that, if left unaddressed, could have caused a system failure during a high-demand phase of flight. Could have. That's the phrase that keeps you awake at night when you work in aviation. Could have. It means, this time nothing happened, but the conditions for something to happen were in place, and conditions don't improve on their own. They drift. The hydraulic seal was replaced. N471HL was returned to service. Nobody outside the company knew how close the drift had come to becoming something else. But Vivien knew, and she added it to the record. Sandra Acaffer's report arrived at Vivien's home office on Thursday, as promised. It was 8 pages. Detailed. Precise. It included the Mrs. Landry incident, the 3 subsequent wheelchair incidents, the recommendation Sandra had made, the dismissal she'd received, and a proposed implementation plan for a real-time accommodation confirmation system that could be operational within 2 weeks at a cost of less than $4,000. Vivien read it twice. She sent it to Franklin with a note: "Implement this, all stations. Sandra Acaffer designed it, give her credit." The system was implemented network-wide within 30 days. Wheelchair assistance response times improved by 41% in the first quarter. Sandra Acaffer was promoted to Regional Customer Experience Manager 6 months later, not because of the system, because of the pattern of thinking that produced the system. The ability to see a problem, design a solution, and present it with data. The ability that had been sitting at the Sutton Ridge station for 7 years, invisible, because nobody with the authority to see it had been looking. Vivien had been looking. Vivien was always looking. Keisha Wells received a call from the Director of Safety's office on a Tuesday afternoon. She was in her apartment in Sutton Ridge, studying for her captain's upgrade exam. First Officer Wells, we're following up on your CRM report from last month, the one regarding the windshear callout on the Nashville approach. Keisha sat down. Okay. We want you to know that your report has been reviewed at the executive level. Captain Mercer has been temporarily removed from the line and is undergoing a CRM evaluation and retraining. Additionally, the airline has implemented a new policy requiring mandatory follow-up on all CRM reports within 72 hours. Your report was one of the factors that prompted this policy change. Keisha was quiet. First Officer Wells. I didn't expect anyone to read it. It was read, it mattered. She hung up. She sat in her apartment for a long time. She wasn't crying, but the feeling was close, that particular pressure behind the eyes that comes when something you'd given up on turns out to have been heard. She called her mother. Mama, remember when you told me to put it in the file? I remember. Somebody read the file. Good, that's how it's supposed to work. It doesn't always work that way. I know, baby, but this time it did, and next time you file it again. Craig Mercer completed his CRM retraining. It took 4 weeks. It was not a formality. The training was conducted by an outside firm that specialized in crew resource management and cockpit authority dynamics. It included simulator sessions, facilitated debriefs, and structured conversations with other pilots who had experienced similar corrections. Mercer went into it defensive. He came out of it quieter. I'm not going to tell you he was transformed. I don't believe in transformations that happen in 4 weeks. What I believe in is cracks, small fractures in the surface of a person's certainty that let a different kind of light in. Not enough to change the landscape overnight. Enough to make it look different. Enough to make a person pause before the next automatic circuit completes. Mercer paused. During one of the simulator sessions, the facilitator placed him in a scenario where his first officer, played by another pilot, called out a terrain alert on approach. The facilitator had programmed the scenario so that the callout was correct. The terrain was there. If Mercer overrode the callout, the simulated aircraft would crash. Mercer's first instinct, his hands, his voice, his body moved to override. I've got it, he started to say. And then he stopped. He looked at the first officer, he looked at the display, he listened. Go around, he said, your controls. They executed the go-around. The scenario ended. The facilitator asked him what happened in that pause, that half-second between the override and the correction. Mercer was quiet for a while, then he said, I heard myself. That's not redemption. That's not absolution. That's a man hearing the circuit for the second time. The first was in Rick's office, when he learned about the woman in the corridor, and choosing in one moment to interrupt it. Whether he'd keep interrupting it was still an open question. The training couldn't answer that. Only the next 10,000 moments could. The next callout, the next first officer, the next person on the floor who he either saw or didn't. But the pause existed now. It hadn't existed before. And a pause in a cockpit can be the difference between everything and nothing. Vivien Price did not seek credit for any of this. She didn't issue a press release. She didn't give an interview. She didn't write an op-ed or accept an award or stand at a podium and tell the story of the pilot who walked past her in the corridor. She went back to her kitchen table. She opened her green notebook, not the original one which she kept in a glass case in her study, but a new one, same brand, same college rule, same color cover. She'd been using the same kind of notebook for 30 years. She wrote the date. She wrote a summary of the changes implemented. She wrote the names of the people who'd contributed: Sandra, Keisha Wells, Gwen, the maintenance director, Darren, the crew scheduler, Franklin Odell, even Rick Talvinen, who, to his credit, had delivered the CRM data on time and had not attempted to minimize or redirect what it showed. She didn't write Craig Mercer's name, not because she'd forgotten him, because this page wasn't about him. This page was about the system she'd built, the system that had drifted, and the system she'd corrected. The people who did the work got their names on the page. The people who caused the problem got the correction. That was Vivien's math. It had always been her math. 6 months later, Helios Air published its annual safety report. The report showed a 68% increase in CRM report follow-up rates, a 41% improvement in accommodation assistance response times, a complete overhaul of the maintenance concern tracking system at Sutton Ridge, which was subsequently adopted as the model for all stations. The report also showed something that couldn't be quantified but that everyone in the company could feel: a shift. First officers were filing more reports, not because there were more problems, because they believed the reports would be read. Maintenance directors were escalating concerns faster. Customer service leads were proposing solutions instead of just logging complaints. The culture hadn't been rebuilt, it had been redirected. Nudged back toward the original heading. The heading Vivien had set in 1996 in a Waffle House booth with a napkin and a ballpoint pen. Every voice matters, that was the heading. And now, for the first time in years, it was more than a line in the company charter. It was a practice, imperfect, incomplete, still drifting at the margins because cultures always drift. That's the nature of organizations made of human beings, but corrected, reoriented, watched. Because someone was always going to be watching. One more thing. On a Wednesday morning, 8 months after the corridor incident, Vivien Price walked into Sutton Ridge Regional Airport. Same time, same entrance, same flat shoes and cream blouse and gray cardigan, same small gold pendant, one wing. She was carrying a cup of tea. The lid was sealed tight. She'd checked it twice. She walked down the executive corridor toward conference room as she was early again. She was always early. As she passed the gate desk, Devon, the young gate agent who'd been there that first morning, the one Mercer had spoken to as if Vivien were invisible, looked up. "Good morning, Ms. Price," he said. He knew her name now. Everyone did. "Good morning, Devon." She kept walking, and as she reached the conference room door, she passed a pilot coming from the crew lounge. Black uniform, 4 stripes, rolling his flight bag behind him. Craig Mercer. He saw her, he slowed, he stopped. For a moment they stood in the corridor, the same corridor where, 8 months earlier, he'd almost stepped on her hand. Mercer looked at her, and she watched him choose. "Good morning, Ms. Price," he said. His voice was careful, not warm, exactly careful. The voice of a man who was aware that the words he used and the way he used them were being measured, not by anyone else but by himself. "Good morning, Captain," Vivien said. He nodded, she nodded. He walked on, she walked on. It took 3 seconds. But those 3 seconds had a weight that neither of them could have explained to anyone who wasn't standing in that corridor. In those 3 seconds was the corridor 8 months ago, and the tea on the floor, and the hand he almost stepped on, and the CRM report and the retraining and the simulator session where he heard himself say, "I've got it," and stopped. In those 3 seconds was 22 years of a career built on the certainty that he always knew best, and a 4-week course that cracked that certainty open just wide enough for doubt to enter. And doubt is where learning lives. Vivien didn't smile, she didn't gloat, she didn't file the moment away as a victory. She filed it as data. Because data was how she'd built everything. One observation at a time, one number at a time, one detail noticed, recorded, and placed into the larger pattern until the pattern told a story that couldn't be ignored. She opened the conference room door and went inside. She sat down at the table. She put on her reading glasses. She opened her folder, and she began to read. Now here's what I need you to think about. Right now, somewhere, not in this story, in the actual world, there's a woman on her knees. Maybe she's cleaning a floor. Maybe she's picking up something she dropped. Maybe she's kneeling beside a child, or tying a shoe, or reaching for something under a counter. And someone is walking past her. Someone with 4 stripes, or a corner office, or a title, or just the ordinary, everyday certainty that comes from never having been on the floor and never expecting to be. And that someone is going to make a decision. Not a big decision, a small one, a half-second decision. The decision about whether to see her, whether to stop, whether to ask if she's okay, whether to treat her as a person or a feature of the landscape. It's a nothing decision. It costs nothing to get right. But here's what the person walking past doesn't know. They don't know who she is. They don't know what she built. They don't know what she's carrying in that handbag or that folder or that quiet, steady mind that's been noticing details and solving problems since before they learned to walk. They don't know. And the question isn't whether she'll survive their assumption. She will. She's been surviving them her whole life. The question is what that assumption reveals about the system they both live in, and whether anyone is paying attention. Somewhere right now, a woman who built something extraordinary is being looked past by someone who works inside the thing she built. And she's not angry. She's taking notes.